The Girl Who Became Death. In the summer of 1941, when the German war machine rolled eastward into the Soviet Union, few could have imagined that one of the deadliest threats they would face wasn't a tank, or an artillery gun, or a bombing raid, but a young woman with a rifle. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and in a world where death was counted by the thousand, hers was tallied one bullet at a time. She would go on to become the deadliest female sniper in history, credited with 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. To her comrades, she was a legend. To her enemies, a ghost. To history, she remains one of the most extraordinary figures of the Second World War, not merely because she was a woman in a man's war, but because she became something far more dangerous, a symbol that could not be silenced. Lyudmila was born on July 12, 1916, in Belaya Tsurkov, a small Ukrainian town south of Kiev, then part of the Russian Empire. Her father was a factory worker, her mother a schoolteacher. By the time Lyudmila was a teenager, she was already fiercely independent, stubborn, proud, and drawn to challenge. When her family moved to Kiev, she joined a local shooting club. Like many young Soviets, she was taught to handle firearms through a national paramilitary program called OSOAVAKHIM, designed to prepare civilians for possible military service. It was there, lying prone behind the iron sights of a Mosin Nagant rifle, that she discovered something few ever do, an instinct for precision, patience, and the quiet thrill of the perfect shot. She would later say, "A sniper must be both calm and calculating. You do not fire for noise. You fire for certainty." At the time, she was just a student, studying history at Kiev University, dreaming of becoming a teacher. But in the Soviet Union of the 1930s, war was never far away. Across Europe, fascism was spreading like a disease, and by 1941, it reached her doorstep. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, millions of German troops poured into Soviet territory. Ukraine became one of the bloodiest battlegrounds. Villages were burned, cities destroyed, and civilians slaughtered. For Lyudmila, there was no question of whether to fight. She would later recall, "I am a Ukrainian woman, and when the enemy came to my land, I could not stand aside." She walked straight to the recruitment office of the Red Army. At just 24 years old, she demanded to be sent to the front. The officer behind the desk laughed. He told her that the army had no need for women fighters, they needed nurses. She insisted. When they still refused, she pulled out her marksman's certificate and placed it on the table. "Try me," she said. The officer hesitated. Then, to silence her, handed her a rifle. "Prove it," he said. She did. Minutes later, after hitting every target with deadly precision, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was accepted into the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division as a sniper. Her first battlefield was Bessarabia, in present-day Moldova. There, she quickly discovered that no amount of training could prepare one for the reality of war. The sounds, the smells, the chaos, the constant nearness of death. Her first confirmed kills came during a German assault on a Soviet position. 2 enemy soldiers emerged from the trees, scouting ahead. She took a breath, steadied her sights, and fired twice. Both dropped. "I remember feeling strange," she later said. "It was not joy. It was not pride. It was only quiet. I knew I had done what needed to be done. That was the beginning." As the front lines shifted south toward Odessa, Lyudmila's reputation began to spread. Her commanders noted her uncanny patience. She could lie still for hours, waiting for a target to make the slightest mistake. She studied her surroundings with the mind of a historian and the eyes of a predator. In Odessa, the fighting was brutal. German and Romanian forces pressed hard against the Soviet defenses. Pavlichenko spent days in camouflaged nests overlooking approaches, picking off officers, machine gunners, and enemy snipers. One report from her division recorded, "Comrade Pavlichenko works with exceptional discipline. Her marksmanship inspires confidence among the troops. She has become the example every sniper strives to follow." By the time the Soviets were forced to withdraw from Odessa after a grueling 2.5-month siege, she had already tallied 187 confirmed kills. But her war was far from over. The next stage of her journey took her to the Crimean Peninsula, to the strategic port city of Sevastopol, one of the most critical strongholds on the southern front. By late 1941, the Germans had turned their full fury toward the Black Sea. Sevastopol was under siege, surrounded by enemy forces, bombarded day and night by artillery and air raids. The defenders, outnumbered and undersupplied, dug in for what would become one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Eastern Front. For 8 months, Pavlichenko fought in the shattered hills and trenches of Sevastopol. Her rifle, a Mosin Nagant Model 1891-30 with a PU scope, became an extension of her body. She painted her face with mud to break up her silhouette, crawled through dust and rubble, and learned to use every shadow, every sound, every movement of wind to her advantage. Her patience bordered on superhuman. One of her comrades remembered, she would lie there for an entire day, motionless, her rifle aimed. Only her eyes moved. And when she fired, someone died. The Germans soon learned her name. Her kills were so numerous that they began broadcasting messages over loudspeakers, taunting her. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, they called out. Come over to our side. We will make you an officer. We will give you fine clothes and chocolate. When that failed, the tone changed. If we catch you, the voice said, we will tear you into 309 pieces. She ignored them. At Sevastopol, Pavlichenko entered what soldiers called the sniper's duel. The Germans sent their best marksmen to hunt her down. She hunted them back. Over the course of the siege, she killed 36 enemy snipers, each one a deadly contest of patience and nerve. Once, she lay still for 3 days waiting for a single sniper to reveal himself. On the morning of the 3rd day, he made the slightest move. Her bullet found him instantly. She later said, when you face another sniper, it is not war. It is a game of minds. Only one of you will rise. By early 1942, her fame had spread throughout the Red Army. To the soldiers at Sevastopol, she became a legend, a figure whispered about in the trenches. Lady Death, they called her. The Germans feared her. The Soviets celebrated her. In May, she was wounded by mortar fire but refused evacuation, insisting on staying with her unit. Only after being seriously injured again in June was she finally ordered off the front line. By that point, her tally stood at 309 confirmed kills, a number verified by official Soviet records. For most soldiers, that would be the end of their story. But for Pavlichenko, it was only the beginning of a new battle, one fought not with a rifle, but with words. In 1942, the Soviet government recognized her as a national hero. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest honor. But Moscow had another role in mind for her, one that would take her far from the smoke and blood of Sevastopol. She was sent on a goodwill tour to the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, not as a soldier, but as a symbol. The Soviet Union wanted to show the world its resilience, to rally Allied support for the Eastern Front. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 1942, she was 26 years old, still young, but aged by war. Dressed in her military uniform, medals glinting under the lights, she was unlike anyone Americans had ever seen. She was introduced to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was instantly fascinated by her. The two women struck up a friendship that would last years. Eleanor later wrote, Lyudmila was small in stature, but her presence filled the room. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had looked death in the eye and never flinched. But the American press didn't know what to make of her. At her first press conference, reporters asked her questions about her uniform, her hairstyle, even whether she wore makeup in battle. One asked if women in Russia were allowed to date soldiers. Pavlichenko's response was cutting, I wear my uniform with pride. I have medals for killing fascists. I wonder if the reporters in your country have as many. It silenced the room. She toured across the U.S., speaking to thousands. In Chicago, she took the stage before a crowd of 10,000 at the amphitheater. The audience, Mostly men listened as this young Soviet woman spoke through a translator about the horrors of the Eastern Front, the burning of her homeland, and the courage of her people. Then she said something that electrified the crowd. "Gentlemen, I am 26 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Do you not think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back too long?" The crowd erupted in applause. Her words made headlines across America. For the first time, Americans saw the Soviet struggle not as distant or abstract, but as deeply human. She was proof that courage, sacrifice, and patriotism were not bound by borders. Even Time magazine featured her, calling her the girl sniper who embarrassed the men. Behind the public appearances, though, Pavlichenko struggled with the weight of her experiences. The United States was peaceful, prosperous, a world away from the ruin she had left behind. She missed her comrades. Many of them had died at Sevastopol after she was evacuated. She stayed with Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House for a brief period, an experience she later remembered fondly. The two talked about women's roles in war, about courage, and about loss. When Eleanor visited Moscow years later, Pavlichenko was among the first to greet her. Her tour continued in Canada and the United Kingdom, where she met soldiers and factory workers, always speaking with the same calm authority. She reminded everyone that while the world was vast, the fight against tyranny was shared. In Britain, a reporter asked her what motivated her to keep fighting after seeing so much death. She replied, "Because I remember what they did to my country. I remember the faces of the children and the sound of the bombs. As long as I breathe, I will not forget." By the time she returned to the Soviet Union in 1943, she was a hero not just of her country, but of the entire Allied cause. The propaganda posters showed her holding her rifle, eyes steady, the caption reading, "Beware, fascists, death is watching you." But the war she returned to was different. The Red Army was advancing now. Stalingrad had been won, Kursk was on the horizon. The tide was turning. Yet Pavlichenko never returned to combat. Her injuries and fame made her too valuable as a symbol to risk at the front. Instead, she trained new snipers, men and women who would carry her legacy into battle. She taught them the same lessons that had kept her alive: patience, discipline, and respect for the rifle. A sniper, she told them, is not a killer. A sniper is a soldier who defends life by taking only what must be taken. Her trainees called her Mother Pavlichenko. Some would go on to become decorated marksmen themselves, citing her as their inspiration. As the Red Army pushed westward toward Berlin, Pavlichenko watched from afar, her name still invoked in speeches, songs, and films. She had become part of the myth of Soviet resistance, the woman who had stood against the invader and prevailed. But beneath the legend was a human being, one who had seen too much, too soon. After the war, she struggled with depression and the scars of combat. She returned to Kiev and completed her degree in history, later working as a researcher for the Soviet Navy. She married briefly but spent much of her life alone. Though she occasionally appeared at veterans' events, she rarely spoke of her kills. To those who asked, she would say simply, "I did my duty." Her story, however, continued to inspire generations. During the Cold War, Soviet propaganda elevated her into near-mythic status, the perfect example of the heroic woman warrior. Western historians, too, eventually came to recognize her as one of the greatest snipers of any nation. But what made her legacy so enduring wasn't just the number of kills, or even her skill. It was what she represented, the defiance of expectation, the courage to stand alone, and the reminder that war makes soldiers out of the most unlikely souls. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the rifle was never about vengeance. It was about survival of her people, her land, and her humanity. She once said, "Every German I killed was a life saved, a child, a mother, a home spared." It wasn't bravado. It was belief. In 1957, years after the war, the United States released a song written by folk legend Woody Guthrie, titled Miss Pavlichenko. It honored the woman whose story had crossed oceans and ideologies. The song's final lines carried the truth of her legend. Miss Pavlichenko's well known to fame, "Russia's your country, fighting is your game. The whole world will love you for the rest of our lives, Miss Pavlichenko, you're the girl with the gun. And she was. By the time of her death in 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become not just a soldier, but a symbol of endurance, precision, and a kind of quiet heroism that transcends borders and politics. But in 1942, as she stood before thousands in a Chicago amphitheater, medals glinting under the bright lights, she wasn't thinking of legacy. She was thinking of her comrades buried in the soil of Sevastopol. And in that moment, with all eyes on her, she gave a challenge that still echoes decades later, not just to her audience, but to history itself: do not forget those who fight for freedom. Do not forget those who die for it. Their names may fade, but their courage must not. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the world emerged from 6 years of devastation. Cities were in ruins, families torn apart, and tens of millions lay dead. Across Europe, soldiers and civilians alike began the long, painful process of rebuilding their lives. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, victory brought no celebration. It brought silence. She had survived the war that consumed her youth, but survival came with a price, a lifetime of memories she could neither escape nor forget. The woman the world once called Lady Death had done her duty. Now, she faced the harder task: learning how to live again. A hero returns home. When Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union in 1943, she was greeted as a national hero. Parades were held in her honor, songs were written about her courage. Her image appeared in newspapers and propaganda posters, the young woman with the rifle, defiant and unbroken. But Lyudmila herself felt uneasy with the adoration. Behind every medal, every cheer, she saw faces, the faces of comrades who hadn't returned. The Soviet Union lost more than 26 million people during the war. Every family bore scars, and every survivor carried ghosts. Lyudmila's were particularly sharp. Her fiancé, Leonid Kutsenko, the young soldier who had served as her spotter and confidant, was killed during the siege of Sevastopol. She never spoke publicly about the pain of his death, but those close to her said she wore his memory like a wound that never healed. In later interviews, when asked about Leonid, she would simply lower her eyes and say, "He died a hero." The quiet years after the war, Lyudmila returned to Kiev University to complete her degree in history. The guns were silent now, but she found herself haunted by the same discipline and precision that had guided her on the battlefield. She devoted herself to study, to writing, to teaching, the life she had once dreamed of before the war. But no amount of books or lectures could wash away what she had seen. In those years, the Soviet Union glorified its heroes, yet it had little patience for their trauma. Soldiers were expected to return to normal life, to work and to build the socialist future. There was no room for weakness, even among legends. Lyudmila did what was expected. She became an historian for the Soviet Navy and a lecturer on military history. She traveled to military academies, teaching new generations of soldiers the art of marksmanship, camouflage, and patience. She was respected, admired, even feared, but she was also lonely. Friends recalled her as kind but withdrawn. She rarely attended social gatherings. When she did, she spoke little of herself. To most, she was a figure of myth. To those who knew her best, she was simply a woman who had given everything to her country and had little left to give. The face behind the rifle. To understand Lyudmila Pavlichenko is to understand the paradox of war. She had achieved what few soldiers in any army could: 309 confirmed kills. She fought with unmatched skill and courage. Yet, in her later years, she often said she wished none of it had been necessary. "I only did what I had to do," she told an interview in the 1960s. War is not a place for glory. It is a place for suffering. Those words revealed a deeper truth, one that many veterans understood but rarely spoke aloud. For all the medals and honors, war never truly ended for those who lived through it. Lyudmila's name became part of Soviet legend, but the person behind the legend was a human being, scarred, tired, and longing for peace. The legend spreads west after her famous tour of the United States and Canada in 1942. Lyudmila's story had spread far beyond Soviet borders. Western journalists were fascinated by her, the calm, dark-eyed woman who had faced the Nazis head-on. She had inspired songs, plays, and even works of fiction. In America, the folk singer Woody Guthrie wrote a ballad titled Miss Pavlichenko, capturing her story in haunting, proud lyrics. Miss Pavlichenko's well known to fame, Russia's your country, fighting's your game. The whole world will always love you for all time to come, 300 Nazis fell by your gun. The song turned her into something larger than life, a symbol not just of Soviet bravery, but of womanhood itself standing against tyranny. For many American women working in factories or serving as nurses during the war, Pavlichenko became a symbol of strength, proof that courage knew no gender. But Lyudmila herself never embraced the celebrity. She saw herself not as a hero, but as a soldier who had done her duty. "I am not special," she once said quietly. "Many women fought. Many died. I was lucky to come home." Between two worlds, as the Cold War deepened in the late 1940s and 1950s, contact between the Soviet Union and the West grew rare. Lyudmila's wartime fame in America faded from the headlines, replaced by the rising tension between the superpowers. Yet in her homeland, she remained a revered figure. She continued to serve in various veterans organizations and was a member of the Soviet Committee of War Veterans, where she advocated for better recognition and care for soldiers suffering from wartime injuries, physical and psychological alike. Despite her fame, she lived modestly in a small apartment in Moscow. Her decorations and medals, including the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union, the Order of Lenin, and several campaign medals, hung neatly framed on her wall. Visitors often described her home as quiet, filled with books and the faint smell of tobacco. Her service rifle, the same Mosin and Nagant she carried in battle, was kept in a locked cabinet. She never fired it again. Revisiting the past in 1957, Lyudmila was invited back to the United States as part of a veterans exchange program. It had been 15 years since she last visited. The world had changed, Roosevelt was gone, the war was a fading memory, and the world now lived under the shadow of the atomic age. Yet when she arrived in Washington, an old friend was waiting. Eleanor Roosevelt, now a private citizen but still one of the most respected women in the world, greeted her warmly. The two had maintained occasional correspondence through diplomatic channels, and their reunion was deeply emotional. Eleanor later wrote in her newspaper column, "My day, Lyudmila Pavlichenko returned to see us again. Time has etched lines on her face, but her eyes still hold the same strength. She is a reminder of what courage looks like, not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it." The visit was short and largely symbolic, but it mattered. It reminded the world that beyond politics and ideology, there were people, individuals who had lived through the unthinkable and still carried themselves with dignity. A soldier's silence as the years passed, Lyudmila's health began to decline. The long-term effects of her wartime injuries, shrapnel wounds, concussions, and the psychological toll took their toll. She rarely gave interviews, but on the rare occasions she did, her words carried the weight of history. In one of her last known public statements, she said, "I want people to remember that the war was not only fought by men. We women fought, too, for our country, our families, our freedom. And we paid the same price." By the 1970s, she was living quietly, away from the public eye. Neighbors described her as polite but reclusive. She spent her days reading and writing in her small flat, occasionally attending veterans' meetings or state ceremonies on Victory Day. Her hair had turned silver, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice, when she chose to speak, was steady. On October 10, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko passed away at the age of 58. The news spread quietly across the Soviet Union and then around the world. The woman who had once stared down the Nazi war machine was gone. She was buried in Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, among poets, generals, and heroes of the motherland. The legacy of Lady Death today, decades after her death, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's name endures as one of the greatest snipers in history, not only for her skill, but for what she represented. In a war that saw the limits of human cruelty, she was a reminder of resilience, of how ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights when their world demanded it. In Ukraine, her birthplace, statues and plaques commemorate her service. In Russia, military academies still teach her techniques to new generations of snipers. Her rifle, the Mosin Nagant she used in battle, is preserved in museums, its wooden stock worn smooth by her hands. Her story is told not as propaganda now, but as history, a story of courage and endurance. Even among professional soldiers, her record stands as a benchmark of excellence. Few, if any, have surpassed her in confirmed kills. Yet numbers alone cannot capture what she achieved. What made Lyudmila Pavlichenko legendary was not that she killed 309 enemies, it was that she survived